There's another quite common misunderstanding about China, particularly about agricultural reform, I want to emphasize here. So a lot of writing in China and also in the West by scholars, they tend to think the success of Chinese agricultural reform because of the incentives or the improved incentive structure. So it's under collective farming, all peasants just employee of the state. So they didn't have good incentives to work hard. So after private farming, they turned over some amount of product to the state, and they were able to keep whatever is left. So they have higher incentives to work harder. But the improved incentives certainly played a role, but that's not the most important factor. What really allowed farmers to transform Chinese agriculture was the economic freedom gained by Chinese parents. So in addition to working harder on the field, now they have freedom to choose different careers. They can, instead of working on the rest field, they can do fishing, they can do something else that they have skills. And they can start a small industry. Indeed, the rise of what is called the township and the village enterprises, that is industry shops started by Chinese peasants, that really played a key role in transforming Chinese economy in the first 2 decades.
Credo che sia forse necessario ricordarci, perché è un po' lontano dal vissuto di chi vive oggi nel nostro paese, dove invece era arrivata in precedenza l'agricoltura comunista. Nel dopoguerra, se non sbaglio, Mao comincia con una promessa piuttosto blanda di riforma agraria, di redistribuzione. Però si arriva invece a una situazione nella quale il controllo sulla produzione agricola è totale. E, cosa particolare, non c'è solo il controllo sulla produzione agricola, ma c'è persino quello sul consumo, perché vengono abolite le cucine individuali e familiari. Forse raccontarvi un po' qual era la situazione dell'agricoltura prima, ai tempi del grande balzo in avanti, potrebbe essere interessante per capire come mai la restituzione della concreta libertà di poter decidere cosa coltivare ha avuto un impatto così forte.
So under Mao's time, peasants didn't have right to decide what to plant on the field, when to farm, what to farm, all decisions made by officials. So, for example, I grew up in a rural area, in a village. So in my village, fishing would be the most profitable business, but that was not allowed during Mao's time. So everyone had to work on the rice field, even though the return was much lower. But the Chinese, the local officials say, oh, you have to produce this amount of rice every year. No one was allowed to go fishing, even though the whole area would be much better if they do engage in fishing. So, but under central planning, it's very hard to allow local officials or local area to take initiatives. Once you give freedom to local authorities, then each is going to come up with different ways to run a business, because different areas have different comparative advantage. So what's wrong with central planning is not planning itself, but they impose a uniform plan everywhere, regardless of the local conditions. So when we say we oppose central planning, not planning that's what we are opposed to, but central, but a plan by the central government. When we do things, we also make individual plans. I mean, we plan all the time. For example, without planning, I cannot be here today. So it's not planning that we oppose to, it's who's going to do the plan. Who are going to be accountable for the consequence of planning. And under central planning, the central government did all the planning, but it's the local people, it's the peasants who suffer from the wrong decisions made by Beijing. So after reform started, the Chinese government realized that way of doing business couldn't possibly work. It failed miserably in Mao's time, and China had to try something different.
Un'idea del grande balzo in avanti in ragione delle decisioni dell'autorità centrale, si stima siano morti tra i 30 e i 40 milioni di persone, tra il 1958 e il 1962. Un periodo assolutamente ridotto di tempo, è come se fosse scomparso dalla cartina geografica un paese popoloso quanto l'Italia. No, ecco, molto spesso il libro di Coates e Wang questo non lo fa, perché cerca di andare a vedere le determinate di lungo periodo, le tendenze, gli incentivi, la cultura, però quando si discute di storia piace parlare, tornare alle grandi individualità. E ora se voi andate in Cina, non dico che vedete una statua di Mao a ogni angolo della strada, però è ancora così, Mao è il grande simbolo nazionale, il fondatore del paese. Invece c'è una figura che non vedete nelle strade cinesi, perché non credo ci sia una statua sola visibile al turista, all'uomo d'affari di passaggio, ma che forse ha avuto un'influenza, diciamo così, un po' diversa, un po' più positiva dal punto di vista del contadino, dell'imprenditore, del lavoratore, del singolo piccolo protagonista delle rivoluzioni marginali. E questa figura è Deng Xiaoping. Ecco, inquadriamo un secondo Deng Xiaoping e ci spieghi anche perché un personaggio così importante nella Cina di oggi, proprio nella toponomastica delle statue, non pare essere stato riconosciuto per il ruolo che invece ha ricoperto.
Deng Xiaoping indeed is recognized today, even today, as what is called architect of China's economic reform. Even though in our book we prove there's no architect of China's reform. But nonetheless, Deng Xiaoping is a very important, if you want to single out any important politician that played a great role in China's economic transformation, that guy has to be Deng Xiaoping. But I would not say Deng Xiaoping that he's smarter than Mao Zedong. Deng Xiaoping learned from Mao's disaster. Deng Xiaoping was a few years younger than Deng Xiaoping, but they came from the same generation. Unlike Mao, Mao wanted himself to be presented as a theorist, as someone who not just a controller, just controls power, but also as someone who has special access to truth. So Mao was presented in China as not just the president of China, but also someone who knows anything. If there's anyone closer to truth, then that one has to be Mao Zedong. So in Mao's time, I grew up in Mao's time, at the end of Mao's time. So we were taught that if you read Mao's leader books, I don't know how many of you have seen or heard about these Mao's leader books. During the Cultural Revolution, everyone in China had to carry a copy of Mao's leader books. And before they do anything, they have to recite some sentences of Mao. And at that time, the Chinese people were taught to believe any truth, if there's any general truth, it all contained in that little book. Then never believed he had that kind of a power. So he never believed anyone could possibly be a possessor, a monopolizer of truth. So that's a very big difference between Deng Xiaoping and Mao Zedong in terms of their personality. And of course, another advantage Deng Xiaoping had, of course, as I just mentioned, he learned from Mao's failure. So he knew that Mao's policy could not continue, and China had to try something different from Mao in order to reach really prosperity and growth in China. So, but there's one policy that made by Chinese government after Mao died. That is, no statue going to be made of any politicians, just to avoid this personal cult, the development of personal cult. So you would not see much. Maybe one or two Deng Xiaoping statue. There is one there in Shenzhen, but you don't see that many. When I went to college in the mid-1980s, any Chinese university that you go at that time, you would see Mao's statue. And then by late 80s, early 90s, Mao's statue removed. Most of them removed from Chinese universities. Maybe a few left today. If you go to Chinese university, a few left, but most are gone. But in the 70s, 80s, you basically see Mao, or if you go back to the 60s, you see Mao everywhere. But I think that itself is a big progress in terms of in our book, we emphasize, we have a sentence there, since if you go to Tiananmen Square, you still see Mao's statue and Mao's portrait there. But we said in our book that if Mao walked out from his coffin today, he would not recognize China as what he hoped for. But Mao came from very quite, it's like a rich peasant family. But Mao thought he fought for the welfare of the Chinese people. He really believed socialism was the best way to bring wealth and prosperity to China. He grew up in a period that the market economy was not just proved was wrong, but really perceived as evil. So he never entertained the idea that the market economy could really work. But I think he would be happy to see the Chinese people now eat better, have better clothes, larger houses than what he could possibly provide. I hope, sometimes I suspect he might change his idea about the market, since the market certainly has proved much, much more superior to state planning in creating wealth and improving people's lives.
Hai nominato prima scienziati. Come mai questa serie di rivoluzioni marginali divampa in questi luoghi particolari? Come mai si comincia dalla costa a cambiare la Cina? Marginal revolution start in the places in which they start.
Marginal revolution was not confined to any specific place. In agriculture, for example, private farming started everywhere. But so, just in terms of the facts, a lot of scholarly writings got that wrong. And if you read Chinese textbook or English textbook used in American universities, they say private farming started in one village in Anhui province. That's one of the poorest areas in China. They say private farming started there, and then Beijing recognized, it of course took some time, but later Beijing recognized private farming worked better, so Beijing changed policy, made private farming a national policy, and then that's how private farming became reality nationwide. But our book showed private farming actually spread out everywhere immediately after Mao died. And indeed, even during Mao's time, private farming was not totally eliminated. There were areas so remote from cities that it is impossible, physically impossible, to do collective farming. So the local officials just ignore the existence of those areas. So the point I want to emphasize is marginal revolution is a widespread phenomenon. It's not something confined to one or two or three places. That's why the Chinese market economy is so resilient. The base of the Chinese market economy is very wide, and its roots is very deep. That's also the reason why I remain quite optimistic about the future of the market economy in China.
Discutendo dello sviluppo, prima siamo stati richiamati dal Presidente Ottolenghi a pensare alla fase del nostro sviluppo industriale. Lo sviluppo industriale cinese, dopo la morte di Mao, come dire, vede anche come protagonisti imprese pubbliche, soprattutto imprese pubbliche locali. Questa cosa, vista da lontano, potrebbe richiamare l'importanza di un forte investimento dello Stato nel settore. Mentre una delle cose che spiegate nel libro è come in qualche modo le imprese pubbliche locali svolgono una funzione un po' diversa rispetto al talento imprenditoriale. No? Non si tratta necessariamente di forme della pianificazione centrale. Qual è stato, come mutano le imprese cinesi dal 1976 a oggi? Come mutano e poi si mutano?
So China had this peculiar divide between urban and rural. So all manufacturing confined to cities. So rural area, you couldn't do anything but farming. And China has what is called a hukou system. So if you're born in a village, you stay there. And in my time, there are only two ways you can move your village. One was if you studied hard, got lucky, got into college. That's one way for you to leave the village. The other one was to join the army. So Mao had this idea that all industrial production had only to be controlled in Chinese cities. So there was no manufacturing facilities in any rural area. But after Mao died, this reform started. So what happened first in China was peasants regained their freedom. So in addition, they could of course have more choices in farming. Now they decide what to produce, but they knew that they could tell easily that industry, manufacturing was much more profitable. So they could earn more money if they make manufactured goods. It's very simple manufactured goods that did not require much capital or much investment. So that's the kind of industry started by peasants. So in China they were called township and village enterprises because these were manufacturing facilities but located in rural area. And they spread out just like wildfire in China, in rural China, everywhere. That's the start of the Chinese Industrial Revolution, not in Chinese cities, because Chinese cities, even after reform started, was still very much controlled by the government. But once Industrial Revolution started in the rural area, those enterprises, most of them private, but they were called state, they were called township and village enterprises. So a lot of scholars misclassified them as collective enterprises, but really they were private. So they started to compete directly with enterprises located in cities, and of course all of them were owned by the state. And it didn't take long for the private enterprises to out-compete state enterprises. And then of course by that time, some private firms also started to emerge in Chinese cities. So quickly by mid-1990s, the Chinese state enterprises could not possibly survive. And by that time, indeed, a lot of them were already broken. So that was the time when a lot of workers, the employees of the state-owned enterprises, lost their jobs, and some, of course, find jobs in the private sector, or some started to set up their own business. But during a brief time period, it's very hard for the workers of the former state enterprises, since they had faced this transition. Since they used to have state guaranteed jobs, now they lost their jobs, they have to find employment in the private sector or start their own business. But if we look at how Industrial Revolution unfolded in China, certainly private sector played the leading role. And today, if we look at the manufacturing sector, 95% coming from 95% of the products coming from the private sector.
Ecco, questo ci porta anche un po' alla narrazione che viene fatta molto spesso della Cina di oggi, no? Un po' perché noi siamo in una crisi molto severa da anni e un po' perché questa narrazione ovviamente si accorda meglio rispetto a un pensiero prevalente, si comincia a parlare di modello cinese, no? Ora, al di là di quei simpatico leader di partito che ha deciso che il nostro modello di sviluppo futuro dobbiamo sceglierlo tra la Russia, la Cina e la Corea del Nord, che ha già cominciato a visitare per imparare come si fa, gli altri paesi invece deve ancora andarli a trovare, ma al di là delle peculiari teorie economiche di Matteo Salvini c'è un movimento molto vasto di persone che ci dicono guardiamo a est, e quando guardiamo a est, se noi guardiamo non al film ma alla fotografia, vediamo ancora un paese nel quale per esempio il sistema del credito, no? È in larghissima misura controllato dallo Stato. Ecco, se guardiamo al bilanciamento pubblico-privato in Cina con la visione dinamica che è stata proposta qui, come sono andate ridefinendosi le proporzioni nel corso degli ultimi 30 anni?
This is one of the most misleading characterization of what is called the China model. It's a British scholar invented that term, China model and the Beijing consensus, basically saying that China discovered a new model of doing the market economy, a model in which the state play a leading role. And using China as a model, say, China did that. But the reason China be able to, in the past 2-3 decades, be able to transform the economy, not because the state played a leading role, but because the state gradually withdrew itself from the economy and gave the market, gave the private sector more and more room to play. If we compare China versus, say, the United States today, there's no doubt the state sector play a much bigger role in the Chinese economy than, say, in the United States. And a lot of scholars and the commentators as well. So from that comparison, they conclude that the Chinese model is one in which the state played a leading role. And they give credit for the success of Chinese economic transformation in the past 3 decades. But that is a wrong comparison as far as our understanding of how China became capitalist. If we want to understand how China became capitalist, we have to compare China today with China, say, at the beginning of reform. And if we conduct that kind of historical comparison, the trend is very, very clear. The state, at the beginning of reform, controlled everything, from production to consumption. Today, the state still controls certain sectors in the economy, like banking, communication, and so on and so forth. But the private sector plays a much, much bigger role than the state. So if we look at the trend, it's unambiguous that the state played a smaller and smaller role in Chinese economy over the 3 decades, and the market played a bigger and bigger role, and that's the reason for the China's success in market transformation. It's not, we recognize and we do give credit to the role played by the state in China's economic transformation. But the leading force coming from the private sector, coming from entrepreneurs. That message, we have to get that right. It's not that China devised a model where the state works better than the market. That's just not true.
Una componente estremamente importante in tutti i sensi del successo cinese sono probabilmente le dimensioni, non solo perché la Cina è un immenso mercato, ma perché in qualche maniera quando noi pensiamo a economie di piano pensiamo sempre a dimensioni quantanti nel caso della Russia sovietica decisamente più ridotte. La Cina invece, se capisco bene, aveva da una parte questa estensione gigantesca millenaria e dall'altra una millenaria esperienza di autonomie, di decentramento, che in qualche modo è necessaria. Come dire, se avete uno Stato delle dimensioni dell'Italia, la devoluzione è una cosa che dovete chiedere per gentile concessione, perché è possibile controllarla per studiare. Nel caso invece cinese, persino Mao aveva dovuto venire a patti con questa natura intrinsecamente decentrata della Cina. Cioè, quanta parte della fortuna della Cina in questi anni è dovuta proprio alle dimensioni vaste e in qualche maniera il fatto che è troppo grossa per essere centralmente controllata, anche se uno ci prova con tutta la determinazione.